A wedding can survive a missing cake, a broken chandelier, even a summer storm, but it can never survive a lie whispered by the heart. The ballroom shimmered beneath thousands of crystal lights, each one scattering warm reflections across polished marble floors that looked untouched by time. White roses climbed towering golden arches. A live orchestra waited in perfect silence, bows hovering just above the strings. Every chair was filled by politicians, celebrities, investors, and families whose names had appeared on magazine covers for decades. They had gathered to witness what every headline called the wedding of the year. Ethan Caldwell, billionaire entrepreneur, devoted single father, and one of America's most admired business leaders, was finally getting married again. Cameras waited outside the estate gates, but inside, privacy ruled every elegant detail. Staff members moved quietly, adjusting candles by fractions of an inch, smoothing linen that already looked flawless, and checking every place card as though perfection itself had become a guest. Standing almost unnoticed among them was Grace Parker. At 27, she had spent years planning weddings that celebrated other people's happiness while quietly setting aside dreams she no longer believed belonged to her. Her navy clipboard rested against her chest as she walked slowly through the ballroom, checking every flower arrangement one final time. She smiled warmly at nervous musicians, thanked exhausted caterers, and gently reassured a young florist whose hands trembled while arranging the final centerpiece. Nobody noticed how carefully she made everyone else feel seen. Nobody except one little girl. 8-year-old Lily Caldwell watched Grace from the grand staircase, hugging a stuffed rabbit that had long ago lost one button eye. She had spent weeks following Grace from room to room, asking endless questions about flowers, ribbons, music, and fairy tales. Somewhere along the way, the wedding planner had become the safest person in the mansion besides her father. Grace looked up and caught Lily staring. She smiled, placing one finger against her lips in playful secrecy before giving the little girl a tiny wave. Lily smiled back for the first time that morning. Across the ballroom, Ethan adjusted the cuff of his tailored tuxedo while several executives discussed the schedule surrounding the ceremony. He answered every question politely, nodded at every recommendation, and thanked every guest with practiced grace. Yet his eyes drifted away again and again. Not toward the breathtaking altar prepared for his future bride. Not toward the photographers waiting discreetly beyond the doors. They searched for Grace. Every time he found her helping someone, calming someone, encouraging someone, a strange quiet settled inside him that no board meeting, luxury vacation, or billion-dollar acquisition had ever managed to create. He quickly looked away each time, almost embarrassed by thoughts he refused to name. Grace never noticed. She was too busy making sure everyone else's day unfolded exactly as promised. A soft melody floated from the orchestra as musicians rehearsed the opening notes reserved for the first dance later that evening. Guests smiled, servers exchanged relieved glances, and everything appeared perfectly on schedule. Then, without warning, Lily disappeared from the staircase. Within seconds, concerned whispers spread gently through the ballroom. An assistant hurried toward Ethan. Security exchanged worried looks. Grace quietly set down her clipboard and slipped through a side hallway before anyone asked her to help. None of the guests realized that the most unforgettable moment of the entire celebration had already begun, and before the orchestra would ever play the first complete dance, one little girl was about to reveal a truth that no fortune on earth could silence. Grace moved quickly through the quiet service hallway, her shoes making almost no sound against the polished stone floor. She had learned long ago that the best wedding planners were invisible during moments of panic. They did not add noise. They became calm while everyone else hurried. One housekeeper pointed toward the east garden with worried eyes. "I thought I saw Miss Lily running outside," she whispered. Grace thanked her gently and stepped through a pair of white French doors. Late afternoon sunlight washed across the estate, painting the gardens in shades of gold and soft green. A warm breeze carried the scent of roses and freshly cut grass while fountains murmured peacefully beneath towering oak trees. It looked like a place where nothing could possibly go wrong. Yet Grace knew children rarely disappeared because they wanted adventure. They disappeared because something inside them felt too heavy to explain. She followed tiny footprints pressed into a gravel path until she reached an old wooden gazebo overlooking a quiet lake. There, sitting on the top step with her stuffed rabbit resting beside her, was Lily. The little girl hugged her knees and stared silently at the water where a family of ducks drifted across the surface. Grace approached slowly, leaving several feet between them before sitting down on the lower step. Neither of them spoke for nearly a minute. The breeze filled the silence more gently than words ever could. Finally Grace smiled. "I had a feeling I would find you somewhere beautiful." Lily kept looking at the lake. "Everybody is looking for me." Grace nodded softly. "Yes, they are. Your father is worried because he loves you very much." Lily's shoulders lifted with a quiet sigh. "Everybody says today is supposed to be perfect." Grace glanced toward the ballroom visible through the distant windows where crystal chandeliers sparkled in the fading sunlight. "Perfect days can still have nervous hearts," she answered. Lily lowered her eyes to the rabbit in her lap, carefully brushing one finger across its worn fabric ear. "Do you think people can smile even when they are sad?" Grace did not rush her answer. "Sometimes they do because they believe it helps everyone else feel safe." Lily turned toward her for the first time. Tears had gathered in her blue eyes without falling. "Daddy smiles like that now." Grace felt her own heart grow unexpectedly heavy. During weeks of planning the ceremony, she had watched Ethan thank everyone with kindness, listen with patience, and carry himself with remarkable dignity. Yet every evening, after the meetings ended and the guests departed, she had occasionally seen him standing alone beside the library window, looking toward the sunset with an expression no success could erase. She had always looked away before he noticed. "Your father has carried many hard days," Grace said quietly. "But every time he talks about you, his whole face changes." Lily managed a tiny smile before it disappeared again. "He laughs more when you are here." Grace blinked, caught completely off guard. "Sweetheart, I am only helping with the wedding." Lily slowly shook her head. "No. You fixed the house." Grace looked around, confused. The mansion stood exactly as it had weeks earlier. Lily touched her own chest. "Not the walls. The quiet." Grace could not find words. At that exact moment, the distant sound of the orchestra floated across the gardens as musicians began another rehearsal for the first dance. The melody drifted over the lake like a memory searching for someone brave enough to hear it, and neither Grace nor Lily realized that Ethan had quietly stepped onto the terrace behind them, hearing every single word his daughter had just spoken. Grace and Lily remained seated as the final notes drifted across the water, neither of them aware that Ethan stood quietly beyond the ivy-covered terrace, hidden by the afternoon light. He had followed out of concern, expecting to comfort his frightened daughter. Instead, he found himself listening to a conversation that reached places inside him no business victory ever had. He heard Lily describe the silence that had filled the mansion since her mother passed away. He heard Grace answer every question without pretending to erase pain that could not simply disappear. Most of all, he heard his daughter say that the house had started breathing again after Grace arrived. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment. For years he had measured success through quarterly reports, charitable foundations, expanding companies, and promises kept to shareholders. Yet the person who knew him best had quietly measured something entirely different. She had counted smiles. She had noticed laughter. She had felt the difference between a beautiful house and a peaceful home. He stepped back before either of them could notice him, choosing silence over interruption. Sometimes the most important truths deserved a moment to settle before anyone tried to explain them. As he walked toward the ballroom, memories followed each careful step. 3 weeks earlier, when Grace first arrived to discuss the wedding, she had not spoken about luxury centerpieces or celebrity guest lists. She had asked one simple question. "What memory do you want your daughter to carry home after this day?" Every consultant before her had focused on appearances. Grace had focused on Lily. He remembered watching her kneel beside his daughter that same afternoon, asking whether she preferred white roses or wildflowers, whether she liked string music or piano, whether butterflies still made her smile. She had treated an 8-year-old girl as though her opinions mattered just as much as every executive attending the ceremony. Lily had responded with something Ethan had not seen in months. Genuine excitement. Day after day Grace transformed more than schedules and decorations. She learned the names of every housekeeper, thanked every gardener, and remembered which chef worried about his elderly father recovering from surgery. She brought coffee to exhausted delivery crews before sunrise and handwritten thank you notes to musicians after late rehearsals. No television cameras recorded those moments. No headlines celebrated them. Yet somehow kindness spread quietly through the estate until even the busiest employees smiled more often. Ethan reached the entrance hall where guests continued arriving in elegant evening attire. Laughter echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings while crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of hundreds of candles. His fiancée, Victoria Sinclair, descended the marble staircase surrounded by stylists and assistants. She looked flawless in every visible detail, her designer gown flowing perfectly behind her. Guests admired her beauty. Photographers discreetly captured every polished moment. Victoria greeted Ethan with a graceful smile that looked practiced after years of public appearances. "Everything is finally under control," she said confidently. "Exactly as we planned." Ethan nodded politely, but before he could answer, Lily entered through the garden doors beside Grace. The little girl reached instinctively for Grace's hand before realizing she should run to her father instead. She hesitated only for a second, then hugged Ethan tightly around the waist. He embraced her with quiet relief, but his eyes lifted toward Grace. She offered nothing more than a gentle reassuring smile before stepping backward into the background where she believed she belonged. Victoria barely acknowledged the moment. She was already discussing seating arrangements with an event coordinator. Ethan watched Grace disappear into the busy crowd, carrying her clipboard once again, unnoticed by almost everyone in the room. Almost everyone. Because for the first time since agreeing to this marriage, Ethan could no longer ignore the growing question inside his own heart, and the answer seemed to be walking farther away with every quiet step she took. The ballroom settled into the gentle rhythm that always arrived just before a ceremony began. Crystal glasses chimed softly as guests greeted old friends. The orchestra paused to tune their instruments one final time. Outside, the evening sky faded into warm shades of amber, casting long ribbons of light through the towering windows. Grace moved quietly from table to table, adjusting a candle here, straightening a place card there, making dozens of tiny corrections that no guest would ever notice because she believed the best work was the kind that disappeared into someone else's happiness. She thanked a nervous young server who had accidentally dropped a tray earlier that afternoon and reminded him that one mistake never defined an entire day. She complimented the florist whose hands were still stained green from arranging hundreds of roses. She even stopped to help Lily straighten the ribbon in her hair before sending her back toward the bridal suite with an encouraging smile. Ethan noticed every one of those moments. He stood surrounded by investors discussing market forecasts and charitable foundations, yet his attention drifted again and again toward the woman who seemed completely unaware that anyone was watching her. She never searched for recognition. She never positioned herself where photographs would include her. She simply found the person carrying the heaviest burden in each room and quietly made it lighter. The realization settled over Ethan with surprising clarity. During the past 3 weeks, Grace had never once tried to impress him. Everyone else had spoken to the billionaire. She had only spoken to the father. Victoria entered the reception hall with effortless elegance, followed closely by 2 assistants adjusting the flowing train of her gown. Guests admired her appearance, and she accepted every compliment with polished confidence. She walked directly toward Ethan, smiling brightly as several photographers discreetly captured the moment. "The press outside says this will be the social event of the year," she said with satisfaction. Exactly the kind of attention the merger deserves. Ethan offered a courteous smile, but before he answered, Lily approached carrying a small drawing folded carefully in both hands. "Daddy," she whispered, "I made something for tonight." Ethan knelt beside her immediately. Before he could unfold the paper, Victoria glanced down and sighed gently. "Sweetheart, perhaps later. We cannot wrinkle your father's jacket before the ceremony." Her tone remained polite, yet something inside the little girl quietly retreated. Lily nodded without protest and lowered the drawing back to her side. Grace witnessed the exchange from across the room while reviewing the seating chart. She said nothing. Instead, a few minutes later, she walked over carrying 2 glasses of lemonade. She handed one to Lily, smiled warmly, and asked if she could see the picture. Lily unfolded the page with growing excitement. Crayon drawings filled the paper. 3 smiling figures stood beneath a giant oak tree, holding hands while butterflies floated above them. Ethan recognized himself immediately. Lily stood beside him wearing her favorite blue dress. The third figure had long blonde hair and held a bouquet of wildflowers instead of roses. Grace studied the drawing quietly. "This is beautiful," she said sincerely. "Your family looks very happy." Lily looked up with innocent honesty that only children possess. "It is the family I keep dreaming about." Grace's smile softened, but she carefully folded the paper and handed it back without another word. She understood boundaries too well to answer what the little girl had never actually asked. Ethan watched from several yards away, feeling emotions he could neither organize nor dismiss. At that exact moment an event coordinator hurried across the ballroom carrying alarming news. One of the luxury shuttle buses transporting several elderly guests had broken down nearly 5 miles from the estate, and the ceremony schedule was suddenly at risk. Before anyone else could react, Grace calmly took out her phone, quietly reorganized the transportation plan, redirected drivers, arranged refreshments for the delayed guests, and reassured every anxious staff member with the same steady confidence she had shown all afternoon. Within minutes, the crisis had disappeared as though it had never existed. The room returned to laughter, music, and celebration. Almost nobody realized how close the evening had come to unraveling. Ethan realized it, and as he watched Grace slip silently back into the background once more, he began wondering whether the person saving this wedding had also been quietly saving the people inside it all along. The mansion glowed with quiet elegance as twilight settled over the estate, and every guest believed the evening was unfolding exactly as planned. Soft conversations drifted beneath the crystal chandeliers while waiters carried silver trays through the ballroom with careful precision. The scent of white roses mixed with fresh baked bread and polished cedar, creating the kind of warmth that money could purchase but never truly create. Grace glanced once more at the master schedule clipped neatly beneath her clipboard. Every vendor had checked in. Every musician was ready. Every guest had arrived safely. Her work was nearly finished. She allowed herself one slow breath before walking toward the bridal suite to confirm the final timeline. Inside, Victoria sat before a large mirror surrounded by stylists making tiny adjustments to her veil. Designer shoes rested beside the chair, and expensive jewelry sparkled beneath the vanity lights. Several assistants reviewed media schedules and tomorrow morning's magazine coverage while discussing which photographs would generate the strongest public response. Grace waited patiently until there was a pause in the conversation. "Everything is on schedule," she said warmly. "The ceremony will begin in 40 minutes, and the orchestra is prepared for the entrance whenever you are ready." Victoria barely looked up from her reflection. "Good. Make sure the photographers stay on my left side during the vows. That is my better profile." Grace smiled politely and noted the request. Before she could leave, Lily appeared quietly in the doorway, still carrying the folded drawing she refused to put away. "Miss Victoria," she asked softly, "would you like to see the picture I made for today?" Victoria accepted the paper with obvious impatience, unfolding it only halfway before offering a courteous smile that never reached her eyes. "It is very sweet, Lily. Perhaps after the ceremony you can make another one that matches the colors of the reception." She handed it back almost immediately and turned toward her stylist. "Please make sure no children wander near the front during the first dance. It distracts from the photographs." Lily nodded without speaking. Her shoulders lowered just enough for Grace to notice. The little girl quietly folded the drawing again and walked into the hallway. Grace excused herself and followed a few moments later, finding Lily sitting alone beside a tall window overlooking the gardens. Evening light painted gentle reflections across the glass while the fountains continued their peaceful rhythm outside. Grace sat beside her without asking questions. After a long silence, Lily whispered, "Maybe my picture was silly." Grace shook her head. "A picture made with love is never silly." Lily looked down at the folded paper. "She never asks about Mommy." Grace felt a quiet ache settle inside her chest. She answered carefully, choosing kindness instead of judgment. "Everyone carries love differently. Sometimes people need time to understand another person's heart." Lily accepted the answer, though it clearly did not remove the sadness from her eyes. At the far end of the hallway, Ethan had just finished greeting another group of business partners when he noticed Grace kneeling beside his daughter again. He could not hear their words, but he saw Lily smiling through tears only moments later. He watched Grace hand the drawing back as though it were the most valuable masterpiece in the world. Nearby, Victoria laughed with several investors about honeymoon destinations and international business opportunities. Ethan suddenly realized the contrast required no explanation. One woman knew how to impress a room. The other knew how to heal a child. As the orchestra began another quiet rehearsal, Lily slipped her small hand into Grace's for only a second before running toward her father. Grace remained standing alone beside the window, believing no one had witnessed the moment. She was wrong. Ethan had seen everything, and somewhere deep inside him, a decision he had not intended to make was beginning to take shape long before anyone reached the altar. The last rays of daylight faded beyond the tall windows as thousands of tiny candles slowly became the evening's only light. Their gentle glow reflected across crystal glasses and polished marble, wrapping the ballroom in a quiet beauty that seemed almost timeless. Guests found their seats while the orchestra rehearsed the opening measures one final time, each note floating through the room with calm anticipation. Grace stood near the entrance reviewing the final checklist. Every detail had fallen into place. Every emergency had been solved. In just a few minutes the ceremony would begin, and her role inside this remarkable day would quietly come to an end. She closed her clipboard and looked around the ballroom one last time, allowing herself a small, grateful smile. It had been the largest event of her career, yet what she would remember most would never appear in photographs. She would remember Lily laughing in the gardens, exhausted employees smiling after long hours, and a lonely house slowly learning how to feel alive again. Grace quietly removed her event credentials and slipped them into her handbag. When the ceremony ended and the reception officially belonged to the family, she intended to leave without saying goodbye. That seemed kinder for everyone. Across the room, Ethan accepted congratulations from business partners who admired his future and praised the strategic advantages of the marriage. He answered every compliment with courtesy, but the conversations no longer reached him. His thoughts kept returning to small moments that should have seemed insignificant. Grace kneeling to tie Lily's ribbon. Grace carrying coffee to musicians before sunrise. Grace thanking every employee by name. None of those moments increased stock prices or strengthened corporate alliances, yet somehow they carried more weight than every contract waiting for his signature. He remembered something his late wife had once whispered years before during a quiet autumn evening. "The people who truly love us always notice the little things first." He had not understood those words completely until now. Upstairs in her bedroom, Lily opened the drawer of her nightstand and carefully lifted out a small wooden box decorated with faded blue flowers. Inside rested birthday cards, pressed wildflowers, and handwritten notes from her mother. At the bottom lay a single folded letter marked in elegant handwriting. For the day your heart knows something before your mind does. Lily had read those words many times without understanding them. Tonight she unfolded the letter once more. The handwriting was soft and familiar. It spoke about kindness, about choosing people who brought peace instead of applause, and about never confusing success with love. One sentence captured Lily's attention more than ever before. If one day your home begins to sound like laughter again, hold on to the person who helped bring it back. Lily closed the letter slowly. She did not fully understand grown-up decisions, business mergers, or elegant ceremonies, but she understood laughter. She understood safety. She understood the way her father smiled differently whenever Grace entered a room. Downstairs, Grace stopped beside the orchestra to thank each musician personally before quietly collecting her coat from the staff office. 1. Violinist smiled warmly. You are leaving before the celebration? Grace nodded. This evening belongs to the family now. The elderly musician looked thoughtfully toward the ballroom. Sometimes families are still discovering who belongs inside them. Grace laughed softly, assuming he meant nothing more than kindness. She thanked him and walked toward the side corridor leading to the service entrance. At almost the same moment, Ethan excused himself from another conversation and instinctively searched the ballroom for Grace. He looked near the floral displays, the reception tables, and the entrance hall where she had spent most of the afternoon. She was nowhere to be seen. A strange uneasiness settled inside him. The ceremony had not even begun, yet for the first time all evening he found himself far more afraid of one quiet goodbye than of standing before hundreds of guests to exchange wedding vows. The soft chime of crystal glasses faded as the master of ceremonies stepped onto the small stage and welcomed everyone to an evening that promised elegance, celebration, and new beginnings. Gentle applause filled the ballroom while the orchestra lifted their instruments into position. Outside, the moon had risen above the sprawling estate, casting silver light across the gardens where thousands of tiny string lights shimmered among ancient oak trees. Everything looked exactly as it had been imagined months earlier. Every flower bloomed in perfect place. Every candle burned steadily. Every guest smiled with quiet expectation. Grace stood alone near the discreet service entrance with her coat folded over one arm and her handbag resting lightly against her shoulder. She watched the celebration from a respectful distance, feeling both grateful and strangely heartbroken. She reminded herself that wedding planners were never meant to become part of the story. They arrived before everyone else, solved every problem, disappeared before the final dance, and left only beautiful memories behind. That had always been enough. She took one slow breath and quietly turned toward the hallway leading outside. At the same moment, Ethan continued searching the ballroom with growing concern. He excused himself from another conversation with board members and crossed the reception floor, scanning every corner where Grace had worked throughout the day. He stopped beside the orchestra. He checked the terrace overlooking the gardens. He even glanced toward the children's play area where Lily had spent part of the afternoon. She was nowhere. An unfamiliar feeling settled inside him, one he had not experienced during billion-dollar negotiations or international presentations. It was the fear of arriving one moment too late. Before he could continue searching, a small voice interrupted the quiet rush of his thoughts. "Daddy?" Lily stood beside him, clutching the faded wooden box against her chest. Ethan immediately knelt to meet her eyes. "What is it, sweetheart?" Lily hesitated before opening the box with careful hands. She removed the folded letter from her mother and held it toward him. "I think Mommy wanted you to read this again." Ethan recognized the handwriting instantly. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as he unfolded the familiar page. He had not looked at it in years because every sentence reminded him of the love he believed he had lost forever. This time different words seemed to rise from the paper. They spoke of choosing kindness over appearances, peace over admiration, and the quiet courage required to begin again. Near the bottom he found a sentence he barely remembered reading years before. If someone ever brings laughter back into this home without asking for anything in return, do not let fear convince you that gratitude is enough. Sometimes grace arrives wearing ordinary clothes. Ethan lowered the letter slowly. His eyes lifted toward Lily. She whispered with complete innocence, "I think Mommy was talking about Miss Grace." Neither of them noticed Victoria approaching from across the ballroom, surrounded by photographers preparing for the ceremony entrance. She smiled confidently as another assistant adjusted her veil and reminded everyone that the schedule could not be delayed another minute. The guests began rising from their seats. The musicians lifted their bows. The opening melody echoed gently beneath the crystal chandeliers. Grace quietly reached for the brass handle of the service door, believing she could leave before anyone realized she was gone. Her fingers had barely touched the handle when she heard hurried footsteps behind her. She turned slowly, expecting another last-minute request from the staff. Instead, she saw Ethan standing alone in the quiet hallway, still holding the folded letter in his hand, his calm expression unchanged, yet his eyes carrying a truth that could no longer remain silent. Grace stood motionless with one hand resting on the brass door handle while Ethan slowly approached through the quiet hallway. Behind them, applause echoed faintly from the ballroom as guests prepared for the ceremony everyone had waited months to witness. The distant orchestra had already begun the gentle introduction to the processional, yet inside the softly lit corridor the world seemed to slow to a single shared breath. Grace offered a polite smile, trying to hide the surprise in her eyes. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. Ethan looked at the folded letter still resting in his hand before meeting her gaze. "I thought you were staying until the first dance." Grace lowered her eyes for a moment. "The celebration does not need me anymore. Everything is finally where it belongs." Ethan answered quietly. "I am not sure that is true." Grace gave a small, uncertain laugh. "The schedule is perfect. Every guest has arrived. Every detail has been completed." Ethan shook his head with calm honesty. "I was not talking about the schedule." Silence settled between them, broken only by the distant sound of violins floating through the hallway. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken, but she refused to misunderstand kindness for something more. She had spent years watching joyful moments from behind the scenes, and she had promised herself never to step across the invisible line separating her work from someone else's life. "You should go," she said softly. "Everyone is waiting for you." Ethan glanced toward the ballroom entrance, then back at Grace. "Do you know what I have been doing all evening?" She smiled politely. "Preparing to get married." He slowly shook his head again. "No. I have been searching for the reason I no longer know how to walk toward the altar." Grace's expression changed immediately. Concern replaced surprise. "Please do not say that because of me." "I am saying it because of the truth," Ethan replied. "For weeks I convinced myself that responsibility was the same thing as love. I believed providing security for Lily was enough. I believed building the perfect future on paper meant I was building the right future for my family. Then you walked into our home." Grace took one careful step backward. "Ethan, you are emotional. This is an important day. You cannot make a decision like this in one conversation." He smiled sadly. "This decision did not begin tonight. It began the first morning I saw my daughter laugh again while decorating flowers with you. It grew every time you thanked someone nobody else noticed. Every time you chose kindness when nobody was watching." Before Grace could answer, Lily suddenly appeared at the end of the hallway, still holding her mother's wooden box. She hurried toward them and quietly slipped her small hand into Grace's. "I knew you had not left yet," she whispered with visible relief. Grace knelt immediately. "Sweetheart, you should be inside." Lily looked from Grace to her father. "Daddy, if you marry someone while wishing they were someone else, everybody will be sad." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. There was no anger in the little girl's voice. Only innocence. Only truth. At that exact moment, the master of ceremonies announced that the bride was ready. The ballroom doors slowly opened. Hundreds of guests rose to their feet. The orchestra began the full processional with graceful confidence, expecting the groom to take his place beside the altar. Ethan remained exactly where he was. He looked at Grace, then at Lily, and finally toward the brilliant ballroom filled with expectation. Without a single hurried movement, he folded the letter carefully, placed it inside Lily's wooden box, took one slow breath, and turned away from the altar, walking instead toward the stage where every waiting guest could finally hear the words he had no longer been willing to keep hidden. Inside his heart. The orchestra fell silent, one instrument at a time, as Ethan stepped onto the stage before the altar, not with the confidence of a billionaire accustomed to commanding boardrooms, but with the quiet humility of a father who had finally stopped running from the truth. Hundreds of guests watched in complete stillness. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above them, yet no one seemed to notice the light anymore. Victoria stood at the entrance to the ballroom, her elegant gown flowing behind her as she searched Ethan's face for an explanation. He met her eyes with genuine respect. "Victoria," he said calmly, his voice carrying through the room without effort, "you deserve a man whose whole heart walks toward you. I believed respect could become love if I simply waited long enough. I was wrong, and allowing this ceremony to continue would only make that mistake greater." The room remained perfectly silent. Victoria lowered her eyes for a long moment before giving a slow, dignified nod. There was disappointment, but there was also understanding. She had always admired Ethan's integrity, and in that difficult moment she recognized that honesty, however painful, was kinder than a lifetime built upon pretense. Without anger or accusation, she quietly thanked the guests for their kindness, turned gracefully, and walked from the ballroom with quiet dignity, leaving behind not scandal but a lesson few people ever possessed the courage to live. Ethan remained still until the doors gently closed. Only then did he continue speaking. "For years I believed success meant protecting my daughter by giving her every advantage money could buy. Somewhere along the way I forgot that children do not measure love by wealth. They measure it by laughter, by peace, by the people who stay when nobody is watching." His eyes searched the crowd before finding Grace standing quietly near the back of the room, still holding her coat, hoping no one would notice her. "Grace," he said softly, "I cannot ask you for an answer tonight because you came here only to do your job. But I could not let you leave believing your kindness changed only a wedding. It changed a home. It changed my daughter. It changed me." Tears gathered in Grace's eyes as every guest slowly turned toward her. She walked forward carefully, almost reluctantly, never taking her eyes off Lily, who smiled with hopeful innocence beside her father. Grace stopped several feet away. "You do not owe me anything," she whispered. Ethan smiled gently. "That is exactly why I trust what I feel." Nearly 1 year passed before the estate welcomed another celebration. This time there were no television cameras waiting outside the gates. No magazine exclusives. No corporate announcements. Only close friends, family, neighbors, and the employees who had quietly become part of their lives. The ceremony took place beneath the same old oak tree overlooking the peaceful lake where Lily had once shared her fears with Grace. Wildflowers replaced extravagant centerpieces. A simple string quartet played beneath the summer sky while children laughed freely across the grass. Lily proudly carried her mother's small wooden box down the aisle instead of flowers. Inside rested the cherished letter that had gently guided all three hearts toward a new beginning. When the ceremony ended, Ethan held out his hand to Grace as the musicians began the first dance. There were no reporters counting guests, no executives discussing business, and no audience waiting for perfection. There was only a husband, a wife, a joyful little girl, and the quiet certainty that real love had never arrived with grand speeches or extraordinary miracles. It had entered their lives through simple acts of kindness, patient hearts, and the courage to choose truth over comfort. As the evening breeze carried laughter across the lake and the first stars appeared above the old oak tree, everyone present understood something that no fortune could ever purchase. The most beautiful homes are not built by wealth. They are built by grace, by second chances, and by the quiet people who teach broken hearts how to dance again.